Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Open Observability Talks. I'm your host, Utan Horvitz, and here at Open Observability Talks, we talk about anything DevOps, observability, and open source. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Logs.io, the cloud-native observability platform. Logs.io uses the best-of-breed open source projects such as Prometheus, Elasticsearch, OpenSearch, Jaeger, and so on. Thank you about that. And for those joining the live stream on YouTube or Twitch, then feel free to ask questions and comments on the chat. It will make things much more interesting, and we'll definitely try and reach out and address some of the comments and questions. And with that, let's move on to today's episode. And today we'll discuss SRE practices and how to establish SLOs as a core foundation of our operations. I'll discuss that with Andy Grabner, who's a DevOps activist at the Dynatrace, and he's also a contributor to the Cncf open source project Keptn for automating SLOs. So let me add Andy to the stream. Hello, Andy. Good morning.
Guten Morgen aus Österreich.
Yeah, you're joining us from Austria.
Austria, exactly.
For joining us. Good morning. And, maybe the best place to start our chat is with your vast history. You've been in Dynatrace for, I think, some 14 years, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's going to be 14 years on April 1st. It's not an April Fool's joke.
That's impressive, especially in our industry, and you've seen our industry evolving, I guess, throughout these 14 years, from the traditional sysadmin days to today's SRE and DevOps practices and observability and so on. So I think it'd be best place to start. Maybe if you can give us your perspective on what's SRE and how it's different maybe from DevOps and the traditional sysadmin role that we've come to know.
Mm-hmm. And again, what I'm saying here is probably my opinion, and everybody has their own opinions and is entitled to their own opinions, which is also great because this allows us to have discussions like this. Because if I would have the final truth, then that's it. And then we don't need any of these podcasts anymore to educate people. So from my perspective, and things have changed also in my perspective over the years since I've been involved in this area. I think SRE, site reliability engineers, are really trying to use as much automation and observability as possible for day one and day two operations, right? And really keeping systems running, keeping systems healthy, but then also making sure that not just kind of fixing things in production as they come along with automation, while this is great, making or executing their actions based on data that they have from the observability platform. I think for SREs, it's very important to also influence the architectures that are built. So therefore, with their knowledge on how systems behave, and also with that knowledge on certain technology stacks, they need to influence and kind of mentor architects, software engineers, so that they really build systems that A, are observable, B, can also provide APIs to make sure that things can be restarted, can be scaled up. Things like circuit breakers need to be included. Whether it's if a backend system is not available, how does a front-end system deal with this? Right? Is there a fallback to a more static version, or like gracefully kind of handling the situation? So basically, in the end, being resilient. And this is where I think SREs really play a critical role, really helping organizations to figure out their observability strategy and their automation strategy to keep systems healthy in production, but then upfront influencing the decisions that are made in the architecture so that this is actually possible.
I think it's interesting what you said, because that's also part of the transition, at least the one that I've experienced in the industry. The emphasis, for example, on automation has grown significantly, probably much more so than 14 or even 10 years ago. Have you seen this shift within the industry throughout these years?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think there's no way around it, because we cannot scale otherwise. We need to use automation. We all know we have a shortage of IT personnel. I think I just read a number yesterday. Alone in Austria, and we're a small country, I think we have like 30 or 40,000 open IT roles, right? And we're a very small country, which means if we are, either we need to educate more people faster, or we need to solve it also through just being smarter with the resources that we have. And smarter means automation helps us a lot with this. And this is a big trend that I'm seeing. The challenge is what to automate and how to automate. Right? I think you always need to automate the things that bring you the biggest bang for the buck, as they would say in the US, right? That's where you need to be smart, and also how to automate. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, and actually, I had a very interesting episode with a senior SRE at Google here on the show last year, and his name is Ramon, and he said that, for example, SRE at Google is a separate organization, and we discussed that. We discussed also different organizations, like, I don't know, Facebook, in which it's structured differently. It's not a separate organization. Obviously, there are pros and cons to each. I'm wondering, how do you see where do you see SRE placed with inside the org chart?
Yeah, again, I don't think there's a one size fit all. I think it's I think it's great that we have organizations like Google and Facebook, and they tell us how they run things, but they have a different history, and they're grown different, and they're just a different organization, like a financial institution that has been around for 100 years and 50 years ago started with the mainframe and now has evolved. So I think it's a little hard to just make the comment and say, this is the way SRE need to be done because Google does it so, and everything else is wrong. So I believe it really depends on the organization. What does not change is what an SRE role should do, and what the outcome of SREs is. As I mentioned earlier, you need to make sure in a world that we live today in 2022, where pretty much everything depends on software being available and running perfectly at all the time, we need to make sure as an organization that we put everything in place that this can be accomplished. And I want to highlight one story that was recently brought up to me. I was fortunate enough, I'm sure some of your listeners know the name Kelsey Hightower. Kelsey Hightower is kind of in the Kubernetes space and in the Cncf world, a known entity, kind of the public face. And I had the luxury of meeting him and actually sitting down with him and have a chat with him at a conference recently. And he told the story when years ago, he worked at an organization where their business was around providing transaction management or transaction handling in the US. When you go to the grocery store and you are a less privileged family, when you don't have enough income, you get these called EBT cards. These are cards that people, like every month from the government, get a certain money, and then you buy it like a debit card. And the team that he worked with was responsible that these transactions actually go through, and the systems behind the scenes do the credit card check or the EBT check, which meant if it didn't work, that there were people that were already not fortunate enough in our society to actually have enough money to buy for the groceries themselves. They stand at the cash register with their family trying to feed them. They are swiping the EBT card, and if some things then don't work, they have to walk home without feeding their family. And I think this was for me a very compelling moment when he said he remembers when they were sitting in a situation in a war room kind of scenario, but they were all relaxed. But then the CTO came in, put the fist on the table, and says, "Guys and ladies and gentlemen, we know you are responsible for feeding people, and if your systems are not reliable, then we have a problem as an organization, but more so that the society we're impacting." So this is why, however you are structured in your organization, whether you have a dedicated SRE team that provide let's say, observability and automation as a service to the development teams, whether they're mentoring or whether they're baked in, I think you need to figure this out for your organization. What we need to figure out is how can we provide software that is reliable and resilient and works as expected, because people's lives might be on stake, depending on your business, obviously.
Yeah, I definitely agree on the mission statement. I just found, at least from my experience, that the org structure does matter, and the organizational culture. On DevOps, it's a long-standing discussion about the cultural aspects of DevOps. So in order to enable the impact, in order to create the synergy between the teams in charge of the applications, the teams in charge of the infrastructure, and the pieces of the monitoring, no, it is a valid discussion, I think, and the different aspects on that.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I bring maybe one last thought on this, because this is the way I initially explained DevOps 5, 6, 7 years ago when I started. And I said, what does DevOps mean? DevOps means if we are a startup, with a great idea, we're 3 people, then we all need to do everything it takes to get an idea as fast as possible to our end users and get the feedback and make sure if something is breaking, then we all get together. So in the end, as an organization, we need to figure out how we get the right things at the right time to the right people, and then consume the feedback and then fix things or improve things. And if you are a 3 people shop, then you may not have a dedicated SRE team because you just handle it somehow. As you grow, obviously, then you need to figure out how this fits best in your organization structure. Yeah.
And if you mentioned DevOps already, so how do you see the delimitation between SRE and DevOps?
Is it the limitation or the dividing line?
The distinction.
The distinction.
Is it the same? Is it different? How the teams work together? If it's 2 different teams, and
so the way I explain it these days, and again, this has also changed over the years because I learn, I see things, and then I adapt also the way I advocate for things. I see DevOps. First of all, DevOps alone is a very loosely defined term because it can mean a lot of things and not enough. What we try to do is use the term DevOps platform engineers. I think we see a lot of DevOps teams that really they are engineers that are providing and working on the platform that enables the development teams to actually get their code safely from dev into production. So DevOps is really about, how can we get stuff from development all the way into production by providing a platform that includes continuous integration, continuous delivery, automated testing, automated quality control, and getting stuff into production, kind of everything until day 0, like deploying it. And then SREs is really what I mentioned earlier. They are using the automation, the observability, as new stuff gets into production to make sure we get the insights, we can react on problems to keep the system reliable and stable. So kind of day 1 and day 2 operations. And so there's obviously, they have to work together because in the end, what combines them, what connects them is that the observability, the SLIs and SLOs that define whether a system runs stable in production, it should not just be monitored in production, as I mentioned earlier. They need to figure out how can the DevOps engineers, the DevOps platform engineers into the platform that they're building already bake observability in, that key SLIs, key indicators, performance behavior, architectural behavior, resiliency behavior can already be monitored and measured in your test environments. Right? I think these things need to be taken care of. This is why there's the overlap, and they work hand in hand. But I think they just have maybe different backgrounds and different experiences on what does it take to get stuff into production, and what does it take to keep it in production safe. But in the end, they have to work together.
Yeah, that's for sure. So you started mentioning SLIs and SLOs and other. So let's talk. And the title of the episode that I chose is centered around the SLO, the service level objective. And I find that many treat it as a technical, let's call it SRE metric, but it ties directly to the business objectives of the company.
Mm-hmm.
At least if you do it right. So. Can you tell us what's good SLO as far as you see it?
Mm-hmm. I want to start with what's a bad SLO. A bad SLO is, and I had somebody challenged me on Twitter 2 weeks ago when I posted a video on kind of 7 SLOs to start with, and then this person responded, and I know him personally, and he sometimes has an interesting attitude on social media. He basically said, stop this BS, stop educating people about SLOs because it doesn't scale, right? Defining an SLO on every single service, if you have hundreds of microservices, and defining SLOs on every single service doesn't scale. And I agree with him. But what I don't agree with him is that SLOs are not important at all. I think SLOs are really important. And now coming to your initial question, what are good SLOs? You need to figure out what is your business goal. And that's exactly what we said earlier, right? I mean, if I come back to the story with Kelsey Hightower, the business goal is that these systems are always on, that these systems need to provide a certain performance, because if they don't perform, if I swipe the card and it takes 5 seconds, 10 seconds, eventually I will have a backup in people that are standing in line. It doesn't scale anymore. Then the supermarkets need to figure out, how to scale their lines, or they go to a different vendor. So I think availability is a big thing, performance is a big thing, and also accuracy, right? So if I swipe the card and the card is valid, then I should get 100% valid responses, and it shouldn't just fail at some point. But I think what are good SLOs to start with is really figuring out what's the business value that your service provides, either to an end user or to a consumer of your API, because not everything is customer facing. Some services are obviously consumed by other services. And I think these are good SLIs to use. Then you define your objective, like always available, 100% if that's possible. Response time, let's say, has to respond within 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds. And accuracy, it needs to respond successful responses to successful queries. And then the next thing is you need to break it down. What does this mean? And this is where I disagree a little bit, I think, with the discussion that the two of us had on LinkedIn, where you said SLOs don't need to be defined on every service. I agree, but if you have a front-end service and it calls to 1 or 2 or 3 layers of important abstractions, then every one of these owners needs to know what is my contribution to the, let's say, the 100 milliseconds front-end performance. Because if there's 100 milliseconds in the front and I have 3 layers, then I can say, well, the first layer can have 10 milliseconds processing time on average on a certain load, and the other one maybe 20 because there's more stuff going on. It's like breaking down an SLO into its individual pieces. And from performance engineering, because this is where I worked a lot, we call this performance budget, to break down a budget we have on the top into individual buckets, and then every team has a certain bandwidth where they operate in. And I think this is where SLOs are great to define the SLOs on the individual API interfaces.
So first of all, I definitely agree, and I think what you said in terms of the key SLOs and concentrating on performance, on accuracy, on availability, these are basic tenets of performance engineering. Have been even before establishing the SRE practices. I think I remember them 10 plus years ago, but definitely are core tenets for SRE. You mentioned my article, my blog post on SRE in the microservice era. I think my point there was very much around, and I think, by the way, the conversation with the gentleman from Google SRE was very much aligned with that, is that people have grown, or SREs have grown accustomed to monitoring the binaries that they produce, and with more monolithic applications where the binary is a significant chunk of the application, if not the entire application, or at least the entire tier, I don't know, all the business tier from a 3-tier application or something like that, it made a lot of sense. And monitoring the binary also monitored a large functionality. But in the microservice era, where you actually deliver artifacts that are microservices, and microservices by definition an infinitesimally important or non-important piece of the logic, then carrying on the same practice as a copy-paste without adapting it is wrong. And I think what you said before is much aligned with that, and the feedback that you got from your customers, because you end up with unmanageable number of SLOs, and also ones that are actually not important by themselves, by themselves. The part that is important ultimately is the user experience and the user's flows, and what the user ultimately impacts the ultimate user experience. And that should derive, again, in the monolithic era, it was one-to-one, because the binary also represented the full flows typically. Now I think people need to step back, go back to the architecture diagram that you mentioned before in the design phase, derive the SLOs from the end-to-end user flows, and then start seeing which SLOs serve to measure that. And I agree with you that you need to break down different steps, because you need to attribute the latency or the performance to each and every step of the way, but in a way that is aggregated, that is manageable, and definitely not that can tie back directly into the main flow. So I think this is the point that I was trying to make. Curious to hear if this is something that you want to challenge to make things interesting.
Yeah, I think maybe we are more aligned to the whole discussion. Maybe I got it wrong initially. I just thought that you were saying there's no need anymore for SLOs on the individual microservice level. And I think there still is, right? And I think we just agreed on this, which is great, because it's not on the individual microservice, but it's always on the package of things that are delivering a certain value to either the end user or to another front-end service. And I think this is where we SLOs are great. And I bring it back to what I mentioned earlier. In my days as a performance engineer years ago, we called it a performance budget. And we broke the performance budget down into the individual chunks. And in the old monolithic or 3-tier architecture, this was easier to break down, because then you said certain things in the front end. When I'm loading a page, I know that I have my images and my JavaScript. Classical Steve Souders, if you remember him from web performance optimization, he had the 80-20 rule, and he said 80% of the stuff happens in the front end in the browser. For certain transactions, it's the other way around, because the heavy lifting is in the back end, but in the end, it's front end. Then there's some business logics running somewhere, then there's the database. And now, obviously, we have, if you look at this, we have the front end. We have a lot of middle pieces, a lot of different services that are kind of aligned with individual business use cases, and then they call more backend services. But in the end, we still have a nice layering, and I think we can use the power of SLOs to enforce our budgets. And that's really what this is all about, getting early warning indicators. And also, in order to scale, because there are businesses that have not only one business use case, but hundreds of business use cases, you cannot manually define 100 SLOs and then maybe multiply by 3 availability, performance, and accuracy. You need to find a way to automate that, right? You need to find a way how you enable your developers, your engineers to define SLOs as code. This is a big thing I think we need to figure out. And I believe most of the SLO frameworks that are out there really provide the definition of the SLI, the metric, the indicator, and the SLO, the objective, in code, and then let it be defined by the developers, or the SREs help the developers to get it checked into the source code, and therefore it kind of travels with the delivery.
I think you gave, just to make things a bit less abstract to the users, you gave in our earlier chat a very good example of a customer that you escorted that did a very nice breakdown with your guidance from the high level business objectives all the way down to the technical SRE metrics. Can you maybe share some of that as an example process?
Yeah, that's a good one, and thanks for reminding me about this discussion, because I was in a similar situation. They came to me and said, help us define our hundreds of SLOs. And I said, well, let's first start with what's your business objective. And that customer was a financial institution. So what do they have? They have a mobile app. Right? They actually had their old financial mobile app, and now they have a new mobile app. And then I said, who owns this app? And then somebody raised their hand. And I said, what's your goal with this app? And I said, well, we need to get adoption of the new mobile app, because that's our future, where we are competitive with our competitors. We need to get the adoption of this app up to 75% by the end of the year. And I said, that's a great business objective. What keeps you from getting there? And they said, well, right now we have terrible ratings on the App Store of the new app. So then I said, so basically the next goal is you need to get the rating up, because it's obviously not nice to look at the 2-star rating. And then I said, yes, that would be a good objective. We want to get to a 4.5 star, which kind of is like 90%, right? Because in SLOs, we always try to talk about percentage numbers. Yeah. And then I said, what are the most complaints from people? And they said, it's crashes. And I said, so that means this is your first kind of link from your business objectives to your technical metrics. You need to get these crashes down, which means you have bad quality right now. So the objective to the development team should be crash rates on supported devices, which is also very important, right? Because if you just say crash rate, crashes can be something different for me than for you. And then we said, okay, so we have the kind of the end user perspective, already 3 metrics: adoption of the new app. So how many users are moving from the old to the new one, the app rating on the store, and then the crashes. And then we said, now behind every mobile app, there's somewhere a backend service. And we said the first service that you interact with is the authentication service that authenticates you as a user. And if I want to use this app, I want to log in and I want to, as fast as possible, say, yes, I'm loading your account details or transactions. So we then said, okay, from a technical level for the authentication service, we need high availability, because otherwise your mobile app will respond back with an error to the user. Sorry, cannot log you in right now. Not good. It also has to be fast. Right? So performance is important, and it needs to be successful in handling the request. That means if I'm logging in with the right username and password, then I should be logged in. And therefore, coming back to the example earlier, we need to be very specific in what this means. So kind of error rate or failure rate is successful attempts should be handled successfully, ignoring things if users by accident enter the wrong user ID or password. Obviously, this doesn't count to the error rate because that's human behavior, human mistake. Yeah. But this is kind of like an example of from adoption of the mobile app, addressing the problem of why people are rating it bad, and then also breaking it down to the individual services and how they contribute to the overall business success.
I really like the example, although I hear it second time around and I still enjoy it because I think it very clearly outlines how SLOs I think should be addressed. So it's an excellent example, and I think also one of the things that I find with SLOs that is very useful is to manage the let's say the tension between the different roles and personas, because you have the developer, obviously, you have the product, you have the SRE, and there are legitimate areas of contention between them, but when you govern that with SLOs, it's easy to regulate, it's easy to balance the cost versus the reliability versus the velocity. SRE wants stability, just for an example. The more stable it is, the easier their job is. But then again, developers want to release and product want to release innovation faster with higher velocity, more value, and then how do you balance that? But when you have this North Star of the SLOs, it's very easy to regulate, at least from my experience.
Exactly, and it's the same thing with, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of OKRs, objective key results, or however you call it in your organization. It's the same thing. You have a certain goal in your organization, right? You want to become the number one in your market, or let's say you want to get 1,000 paying customers by the end of the year. And then you break it down, and what does this really mean? How can you get there? And then you can figure out how you, as in my case, Andy Grabner, how can I contribute to this, even though I'm just somewhere 3 levels down the hierarchy. But I know that if I'm writing an authentication service that works and is available, and I talk with the SRE team so that they can give me some insights on how I can make this more robust and more resilient, then I can build something that contributes to the overall goal. And that's really what it is. So I think having this top down, and also understand where you live, because otherwise you just work for an organization and you don't even know what is your impact on the bottom line, which is actually in this case the top. What's the impact on the top goal?
Line?
Yeah, on the top line. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think for me at least, having this very transparent to engineering it made it very easy for them to find the value in what they produce. Obviously to everyone, but let's say product, for example, is naturally more exposed to the high-end goals than others. But for example, engineering, that usually many organizations treat it as a back-end function in terms of exposure to the high-level goals. I think that is, for me, it's an anti-pattern. I think that actually relaying it transparently gets them very eager and very adamant in getting these features done, and also focusing on the right areas, because engineers like perfection in every point, but if you focus on the impact on each point, then they can focus the efforts on the places that matter most. So that's interesting. And maybe another question related to that is, so who owns SLOs? Who's in charge of the monitor, and who's in charge of the remediation as far as you see? So the definition, the monitoring, the remediation.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and tough to answer. Coming back to the example I mentioned earlier from this financial institution, I think owning means who has an interest in getting this metric and bringing it to the right value. So what I mentioned earlier, the adoption is a business metric, business owner. Is it available? Is a metric that site reliability engineers can impact, as well as development can impact. Because why? SREs can make sure they are provisioning the right failover strategy. They are making sure that their auto remediation is put in, right infrastructure is there to actually support the load. On the other side, the engineers can obviously work on the aspects of quality, so that the system is just by default available, or at least higher available. So I think it's very important, first of all, to every SLO define who is responsible for that SLO in a way of who contributes to it and who can impact it. In terms of how do we get the metrics, how do we get the SLIs and SLOs, I see this, in my perspective, the people I work with the SRE function within an organization, because SREs, right, a lot of their work is around automating stuff based on observability data. And the SLIs, the indicators, are coming from your Prometheus, from your APM solution, whatever it is, right? From your logging, from your logging system. I mean, so I see in a lot of organizations, it's the SRE role, whether this is a dedicated SRE team or whether this is part of another observability team, but it's part of, it depends on the organization. But I think they are responsible to provide this. And then they need to enable the individual stakeholders to define their SLIs. What is the metric that they want? Help them to get this metric, define an SLO, the objective, and then also what should the action be in case this SLO is not met. But I think the SRE team is then the enabler to the development teams, to the business teams, to let them define this in a very easy way. And easy means for developers, it could be a YAML file somewhere in a Git repository. For the business, it might be a point-and-click solution, because they might, and I don't want to say the business is not technically capable of doing YAMLs, but I think you want to make it appealing to the stakeholder on how to define and maintain these SLIs and SLOs.
Sounds good. And then the actual monitoring and remediation, where do you see that lie within the organization?
I come back to the SRE again, where I'm not saying that the SRE is responsible for everything here, but the SRE needs to provide the foundation of the remediation. So what we have been, one of the projects that we've been working on over the last couple of years is the Cncf project Keptn, where one of the use cases is that Keptn is taking observability data, like, hey, something is wrong, your SLOs is about to be impacted, or your server is down or something, and then is triggering all the remediation sequences. And these sequences are defined in if you put it in a kind of traditional way, in a codified runbook, right? So you have a runbook, and then you codify it, so you can declare what you want to be executed for a particular problem, and then we take care of it. Now, who is responsible for this? I think the SRE would be the one that brings in this type of automated remediation into the platform. The user of it, like the definition of these runbooks, we call them automation sequences or remediation sequences. Some of them will be done by the SRE, right? Because you want, there's certain things from the infrastructure perspective, like spinning up a new node, scaling up, changing load balancing routes and stuff like that. This is something that an SRE will bring to the table. On the other side, a development team may define their own rules and say, hey, we're running some experiments. We have a new feature flag, and if we turn the feature flag on and then we are breaking our SLOs with that, we want the auto remediation to just switch the feature flag off. And I want this to happen automatically, and I don't want to be woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning. So this is why I think what I see is it's the SREs that are providing the functionality. They're using it themselves for infrastructure-related remediation, but then they're enabling the development teams to define their own more app-focused and service-focused remediations.
Sounds good. I see we have a question here from the audience. The question is, where does the responsibility sit within less mature organizations, or orgs that don't have a defined SRE role?
It's a good question. I think in any organization, mature or not mature, I assume you have somebody that is responsible for your infrastructure, that is responsible for keeping your digital services up and running. And I think they would be benefiting the most if they would invest in something like observability, in measuring your SLOs, and then also investing in auto remediation, because I guess in less mature organization, this right now means there's a lot of things that happens manually because there's less automation in space in place. There's just not enough data available to make good decisions. So I think they would benefit most. And then the question is, do you have this capability in-house already? Do you maybe need to hire new people that you bring in that already have this expertise? And with hiring, I mean, either hiring people that then work for you, and there's also no shame in just saying, hey, I need an external help from a consulting company that gets me started. And then you figure out if this new role then fits in your current team structure, or whether at some point it's time to have a dedicated SRE team that then, takes care of observabilities. They are educating people, putting it into the platform, and so on.
Sounds good. Thank you for the question. And to the audience on the live stream on YouTube and Twitch, if you have more questions, feel free to type them in the chat and we'll try to address them. So thanks for the question. And going back to, you mentioned Keptn, the new project. Essentially, it's a project that was developed at Dynatrace, right? And then it was open sourced and they contributed to the Cncf. So first of all, I was very happy to hear just this morning you shared with me that it's about to move from the sandbox into incubation in the coming months. So really exciting news. So congrats on that, and holding the fingers crossed that all the formalities in the process, the last mile goes smoothly on that. Do you want to share with us why Dynatrace even started the project in the first place? Why going open source, and a bit of background about that?
Yeah. So the motivation was interesting, because what we have done over the years, we always try to advocate to our customers, how can you bake observability into your current delivery process and into your current remediation process. And before we started with Keptn, right, we always showed them, hey, what do you have? Oh, you have Jenkins, and you're using this test tool, and then you have Ansible for deployment and for configuration management. And so we said, okay, we can show me your Jenkins pipeline. And now we're building in your Jenkins pipeline, not only the deployment, after the deployment, we do some sanity checks, reaching out to observability platform. Then we call your testing tool. Then we are pulling data back from the testing tool. And then we are also pulling data back from the monitoring tool, in addition to the testing tool metrics, and then make a decision. And in the end, it worked well for the first, for the second, for the third. And then we realized, damn it, we're building the same thing all over again. And these Jenkins pipelines become hugely complex. And so why has nobody ever solved that problem to kind of come up with with an easier way of connecting your individual tools that you have in your toolchain, deployment, testing, evaluation, configuration change, and in the middle, also reach out to observability platform to then make better data-driven decisions. And this is where Keptn came about. We said, we understand that there's certain processes that organizations have: deployment, test, evaluate, promote, for instance. But they may have different tools, right? And in this case, they have Jenkins they use Jenkins, and the other one they use Helm. They may use some JMeter or some Selenium or some other tools. And so what we wanted to avoid is having to write and copy and paste the same kind of large pipeline automation scripts and then adapting it with individual tools and kind of have a hard coding. So what we did, we separated process from tooling. In Keptn, you can define a process. We call them automation sequences, where you just say, I want deploy, test, evaluate, promote. And then we have an event-driven model, which means you can have one or multiple tools subscribing to one or multiple events. And Keptn is then basically the event-driven orchestrator just to enforce the process, and is connecting to your tools through loosely coupled events. And between the individual steps, we also connect to your observability platform to also ask for, hey, observability platform, give me your SLIs, give me your SLOs in this environment where we just ran tests. Is everything green or is it red? Because with this, we can make automated decisions. So what we have seen is...
And that allows the gating, right? So essentially, asking, it also provides a gating.
Exactly.
It allows to proceed or not.
It allows two things. It allows gating as part of your DevOps delivery process. Remember, I talked about what is DevOps do. DevOps platform engineers kind of provide the mechanisms to get stuff into production, but you can use then this data as gates. And for SREs, for your auto remediation, use SLOs to figure out, hey, I'm in runbook step number 1, or we call them remediation sequence steps. We executed first step. The system is still red. Let's execute the next step. It is still red. Let's execute the third step. Now the system is back to a healthy state. So that means on the one side, we use it for gating. On the other step, we use it for validating and also steering the remediation process. Because just as a human being would do, right? You have your run book and you say, click this button, restart, and then watch your dashboards if it goes green. After 5 minutes, nothing, no, it didn't solve the problem. Let's do the next step. And the last step might be call the engineers at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so we automate the whole thing as well. Right? And therefore we use SLIs and SLOs as kind of for your release validation, for your quality, for your gating, as releases shift into prod, and then we use them to really control and observe the impact, hopefully the positive impact of your remediation strategy.
Nice. And who is besides Dynatrace? Obviously, who else is involved in the in this Cncf project of Keptn?
I mean, you can. Fortunately, it's all public. We have the majority, to be honest with you, right? I think we have about 80 or 90% of the core maintainers from Dynatrace because we just started. But we have people from Microsoft, we have people from Citrix, we have people from Real Dolmen, from Neotus, so that I think the Cncf stats that you can see who is contributing to it. Yeah. But on the one side, it's contributing, and the other ones are users. I think what's really interesting for most, while we encourage everyone to contribute, whether it's a code contribution, a documentation contribution, a tutorial, a lot of the folks we have in our community are our users. And here we have, for instance, Story, and this is close to my heart, close meaning also geographically close, the software company that is responsible for most of the Austrian online banking software. They're called Raiffeisen Software. They just went on a webinar with me recently, and they showed how they are using Keptn as part of their release validation process. So exactly using these SLIs and SLOs after every new release that is getting pushed through their existing pipeline, and Keptn is then pulling in the data, in their case from Dynatrace, and say, good release to go all the way to production for all the Austrians out there, or not good, right? So that's a great story. Other stories are from Volution. I remember them very vividly as well because they also were in a webinar with me recently. They started with Keptn and to automate the complete end-to-end delivery workflow with blue, green, and canary deployments. And the strength of Keptn here is that they can easily decide, because it's an event-driven model, which tool they want to use for the delivery piece, for instance, right? They may have started, I think, with an Azure DevOps pipeline, but now moving over to using Argo rollouts, and Keptn is then just orchestrating it. And because you loosely coupled, right? You can say, I use this tool right now, but tomorrow I switch the tool, but I don't need to change any coding because it's event-driven. I obviously need to provide the configuration for that tool, but this is all in Git. So we have version control. So instead of calling a certain pipeline from the existing tool, what they needed to provide is just the CRDs that Argo rollout can use. But then it's a done deal. Yeah?
And a platform such as that, again, the richness of integrations obviously is a key. And I know that you have quite a rich suite of integrations. So that's I think something that will promote the project very much. And another point that is related and very relevant is your work and the work under the Continuous Delivery Foundation, the CDF. First of all, congratulations for being elected as an ambassador in the CDF for 2022. So applause for that.
Thank you.
And for those the audience that are not familiar, we've been talking about several open source foundations, but I believe we haven't actually touched the CDF. Can you tell us a bit about the CDF under the Linux Foundation?
Yeah, a CDF, as the name kind of implies, it's a continuous delivery foundation. So it's really a community that brings together all of the users and also the tools in the CD space, continuous delivery. Obviously heavily is there. You will find tools like Jenkins that have been instrumental over the last years in really bringing continuous delivery to where it is today. And it's really a group that wants to drive certain standards forward, and this is where the interest from our side also comes in. Coming back to the eventing model that I mentioned earlier, right? We didn't want to just come up with our own events because then it's again proprietary. What we wanted to do, we wanted to take our events that we have defined right now to call these tools and raise it to the next level where we can in the CDF itself. There's a special interest group for CD events, so they're called CD events, where we come to a consensus with all the other tool vendors out there on what should these events look like exactly. What's the payload for a deployment, a test, an evaluation, a promotion? And so we're currently working in this particular group in the CD through the CD events to really specify a globally accepted standard. Because why is this great? The great thing is if we all agree on a standard, then it will be less painful, zero painful, hopefully in the future, to integrate a tool into your orchestration. Because right now, every tool has their own API on how you call it and has their own way you call it and the result that comes back. Now, what we are doing with Keptn, we have brought up our initial event standard. And for the first tool integrations, we have built kind of our own kind of proxy that takes our event and then converts it into a call of that target tool's API and waits for it's done. We call this a Keptn service. Now, this is a nice way. It works. We also have a way to easily call external tools by just specifying APIs through a webhook service. However, where we want to get to is we just want to make sure that the tools in the future, deployment, testing, evaluation, monitoring tools, notification tools, they natively support the CD event standard, which means in the future, if I am signing up for a new tool and this tool supports that standard, I can just say, hey, you tool, you are now subscribing to your favorite orchestrator. Could be Keptn, maybe in the future something else also comes along, but now you're connecting, you're subscribing, and there's no additional overhead. There's no overhead anymore to write kind of this proxy layer that takes these events we're using and then calling the proprietary API. And this is the vision that we have with this. And
I think it's really exciting. Also posted on the chat here for our viewers on Twitch and YouTube the link to the GitHub page for the CDF and specifically the SIG events. Very interesting activity, and I'm a strong believer in open standards. I think this is the way to converge, especially in things such as that are orchestrators by nature. I've been in around different types of orchestration for the past, I guess, 10 years or so, and I've found that it doesn't work any other way. If you need to converge and be able to create, I think it's been seen very, very nicely. For example, with metrics, with open metrics and Prometheus having like a standard in which it's been exposed exposition format, and then it's very easy to plug in Prometheus compatible frameworks to just pull scrape the metrics and present them, and it creates decoupling and standardization. I think something very, very nice can be similarly here with the CI/CD tools and similar. The last point before we run out of time, I wanted to mention also that you're also a fellow podcaster, and you have a very exciting podcast of your own called Pure Performance. Would you like to share that with the audience?
Thanks for allowing me to make some ads here. So Pure Performance, spelled as one word, Pure Performance. You can find it on your favorite podcast app. We started it, I think, 3 or 4 years ago now with one of my colleagues. We are both performance engineers by heart. Brian Wilson, he was actually a performance engineer in the previous company before he joined Dynatrace. And I have performance also in my heart, because before Dynatrace, I was also working for a performance testing company. And we said, we want to explore the new option of podcasting, at least new for us, to educate people on what are common performance problems, what do people run into, why do systems fail, and what can we learn from it, and what can we share. It was also very much inspired by a couple of folks that we've known over many years. It's the guys from Perf Bytes. So there's another podcast called Perf Bytes. They've been doing podcasting longer than we have, and they also had lots of great stories. And at some point we met them at a conference, and then they said, hey, why don't you just do your own podcast and focus on your performance engineering community, focus on DevOps, on the upcoming SRE. And this is what we've been doing now for the last 2 or 3 years. Every other week, we try to bring in as many external folks as possible ranging from people in the industry that actually work as an SRE, as a performance engineer. People from, we had several Googlers, for instance, on the call as well, talking about SREs. We had Gene Kim, right, who is, I think, a known entity when it comes to DevOps. We had him on the show 2 or 3 times, talking about the Phoenix project and then the DevOps handbook, and so on. And it was really, and one that I was more recently was with Nana from Tech World. With Nana, she's kind of a YouTube star these days, because she's been, since the pandemic started, created a lot of great educational content on cloud native, on observability, on CI/CD, on YouTube. I think she has like 500,000 followers. I think, Dotzen, this is still a goal for both of us to reach at some point. Yeah. But so if anybody's interested, Pure Performance is the podcast.
Sounds great. And how can people reach you after the show with further questions and comments? And
yeah, I think people see my name here, Andreas Grabner. That's the easiest way you find me on LinkedIn, @GrabnerAndy. That's my Twitter account, and pretty much the username for pretty much all of my online social media activity. You can also see me obviously in the Keptn space. So I think you posted earlier the Keptn website. And I would really encourage you, because there's a lot of cool stuff happening. Also, if you happen to be at KubeCon in Valencia, that's coming up in 2 months, we're going to have a big presence there. And we also part of Google Summer of Code, which I wanted to mention. Just want to make sure that some of these things, if you're interested and want to kind of start contributing to open source, we're part of Google Summer of Code. Reach out to us, check it out.
Sounds great. I will definitely come pass by the booth at KubeCon. Looking forward to it in May. Another, by the way, a very interesting event the same month, earlier that month in May, is SLO Conf, which is also very interesting and very, very focused on this area that we talked about extensively today, the SLO, service level objectives. Going to be there also online. I know that you're going to be there, so we can invite the audience also, for those who want to dive deeper into the specifics on SLO, the art and the practice of SLO. I think it's a nice forum. And with that, I'd like to first of all thank you very much for the very interesting conversation, Andy.
Thank you.
And I would like to invite you to stay with me for the last bit, which is, as we traditionally do, the as we call it, the breaking news. And today I wanted to actually devote a large part of the breaking news to an interesting micro survey that the Cncf released about cloud native observability. It was released actually last week, March 8th, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And I actually found it quite insightful. I'm just looking quickly to share here with the ones on the stream, although, of course, we'll share for the ones that are on the links and on the audio only. We'll definitely share the rest of that. But what I wanted to note, several interesting observations from that. One is about the platforms themselves. As you can see, the popular projects that are being used for observability wasn't too much of a surprise for me, but I think it's a good validation. We can see here the Prometheus leading the charge with 86%, and following it OpenTelemetry and FluentD and Jaeger. All of these are actually also projects that we've been discussing here at Open Observability Talks podcast. Very interesting to see. And also, we can see Thanos that we've been discussing, and Open Tracing that merged into OpenTelemetry and Cortex. So it all comes down to I think the same common stack that I've been also seeing around the ecosystem that I've been around. How do you find this? I'm sure that you're not surprised either.
I'm not surprised at all, because this is right. I mean, in my day work, and both of us, right, we are in the observability space. In my day work, I see exactly these frameworks and these projects showing up. And this is why it's also so important that these are supported also by vendors like us, right? I can talk about, I guess, for you as well. You are supporting and probably also contributing engineering resources. We do the same from a Dynatrace perspective. We're contributing teams to making this even stronger than it already is. Yeah.
That's definitely it. And other interesting insights from that that I found, at least, is beyond the best of breed stack, is about the challenges, which is usually what is more interesting to look forward. So maybe this is specifically about the projects, but even before the projects, about challenges in observability, I think the number one is about the number of engineers and teams that are using multiple tools. This tool sprawl, as I call it, is a really recurrent pain. This is actually something that I've been last week I was at the DevOps conference, and during my talk there I also posted a poll to the audience, and it came out with the very same result about the high number of tools that are being used for fetching telemetry, for analyzing, for storing. I think this is a significant problem that keeps on popping up in our ecosystem. And another one we talked about before, about the projects themselves and what challenges people have with the projects themselves. We see number one is the complexity, just plain too complex to understand or run. Which is still a challenge. All the projects, I think, are facing that. I see that in OpenTelemetry. I see that with Prometheus and many others. A lot of work is being done to try and make it more accessible. But still, I think this is something that we as a community need to look into that. And we see also, lack of supporting documentation, which obviously feeds into that complexity and similar related topics. Another point that I found interesting is a question that was asked about what concerns prevent people from adopting or extending adoption. And I saw the integration as I highlighted it here. It's number one. Again, because of so many tools and so many systems, we talked about it a bit also in the context of Keptn. These needs to address the different, the vast ecosystem and the many tools via integrations makes it quite a bit of a challenge. And each tool is its own silo. And these silos and making them work in conjunction is, I think, a recurrent concern. And any thoughts about that? Any insights that you found out?
No, I think you just mentioned it, right? We are really trying. One of the things we're solving is exactly this here, because we are the integration hub, a standardized integration hub between all of your tools and your observability, and kind of connecting all of your tools basically to the backbone, which is your observability. And if people are having challenges with the complexity of the current systems, the tool sprawl, I mean, this is exactly what we are solving with Keptn, or trying to solve with Keptn.
Yeah, so very interesting. I will share the link to the survey, to the micro survey, also with the forum. So you can. I definitely recommend checking it out. I don't think we have too much time for additional news and breaks, but this is definitely something that I wanted to spend some time on. So with that, I'd like to thank you again, Andy, for joining me. And I'd like to thank all the audience for joining us here on the live stream and on the podcast. As always, all the episodes are available on your favorite podcast apps or on YouTube, so you can find it on the video cast format as well. If you are listening to this on a podcast app, do know that we also stream the episodes live on Twitch and YouTube. So do follow us to see when the next live stream is, and then you can join and ask questions and put your comments and get more engaged with the conversation. You can find all the details at openobservability.io, and you can also follow us on Twitter at openobserve, or me directly at Horovitz, HOROVITS. If you yourselves have if you're involved in an interesting project, or you have an end user story or anything else interesting for the forum, feel free to reach out on the CFP, call for proposals on the openobservability.io website, and we'd be happy to have more people contributing to the community discussion. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Dotan Horvitz, and see you next week on the Open Observability Talks podcast. Thank you.